Great power competition between China and the United States is intensifying. China's Communist Party-ruled government is engaged in the most dramatic military buildup of any nation since World War II. Beijing is on track to amass 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, and there's growing concern in Washington that China is operating a Cold War-style cognitive warfare campaign designed to weaken U.S. democracy. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at The Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series, we're at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we're joined by Seth Jones, Director of the International Security Program here, and a renowned expert on transnational threats, irregular warfare, American defense strategy, and great power competition. Seth, thank you for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
You've been providing national security policy recommendations for decades, often testifying before Congress and leading bipartisan research groups. You recently co-authored a white paper warning that China is dangerously outpacing the U.S. defense industrial base in the 21st century. Let's jump right into this. You argue the U.S. president needs to do more to create a sense of urgency around this situation. You've called for the White House to create a new body, presumably a new agency or department, to oversee specifically the revitalization of the U.S. defense industrial base. Why are you recommending this?
Yeah, so good question. I think just to step back, I think the situation the U.S. finds itself in is in a very different period from where we've been the last couple of decades. At the end of the 1980s, Soviet Union collapses, and we go from this bipolar competition with the Soviets to largely a unipolar world. So over the course of the 90s, U.S. doesn't really have to worry about any major competitors. 9/11 happens, and then obviously we get into about 2 decades of concern about terrorist organizations, whether it's Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, or others. The situation we're in is very different right now. We have active wars in the Middle East, really generated by the Iranians. We've got an active war in Europe with the Russians and the invasion of Ukraine. And then in the Pacific, we've got a China whose industrial base, defense industrial base, is on a wartime footing, which means it is producing weapons systems designed to deter and to fight the United States in particular. So that defense industrial base is churning out aircraft, including 5th generation fighter aircraft. It's churning out naval systems, including aircraft carriers, cyber, space-based capabilities, as well as land systems, including some very sophisticated types of weapon systems like hypersonic glide vehicles. And then the network that pulls those together, which is in some ways roughly equivalent to what the U.S. calls its Command Joint All-Domain Command and Control, so CJAD, C2. And I think that the challenge is the U.S., when we look at the industrial base and the challenges it faces in the U.S., we're operating on what I would call a peacetime environment. And that includes, when we look at our broader defense ecosystem, the Department of Defense, the State Department, Commerce, Congress. In order really, I think, to focus our defense industrial base for the security environment that we're in right now, it's going to require something above a department or agency, including the Department of Defense. When the U.S. has been in this period before, so late 1930s, before the U.S. is involved in World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt creates the National Defense Advisory Commission, or NDAC, and then a little bit later, the War Production Board, designed entirely to put the U.S. on a wartime footing to build defense industrial capacity, to start cutting through red tape. And then we saw that at various other periods over the next couple of decades. We saw it with Truman in and around the Korean War. We saw it during the Vietnam War period, and we saw it during the Reagan buildup, where we were in a Cold War, not a hot war, but a Cold War with the Soviets, but a need to build up defense capacity. We don't have that right now.
Let's drill into the current U.S. defense industrial capacity in comparison to what the Chinese government is doing. What is the supply chain for China's military industrial production? How does it compare to the U.S. supply chain? And just directly, is the U.S. supply chain actually dependent on China?
There are some types of minerals that go into defense production that the U.S. does rely on for China. Actually, the same thing, frankly, with the Russians, including titanium. But different elements that go into weapon systems, nickel, for example, do generally require either Chinese or Chinese-owned mines. Now, just taking a step back, I think the big challenge is on production. Chinese production. So if we take the maritime industry right now, because I think Asia Pacific,
a lot of people say the Chinese Navy is bigger than the U.S. Navy.
It has more ships.
Has more ships.
Yeah, it has more ships. But the production capacity is what's really disturbing. The one Chinese shipyard, like Zhongnan, is larger than all U.S. shipyards combined. The general capacity of the Chinese maritime defense industrial base to build ships is 230 times the size of the U.S.'s. Now,
why? And is that just because of American hubris and that the United States has lulled itself to sleep as the most dominant security power in the world? I mean, how did it come to be?
And we have not put in the resources to build a maritime defense industrial base, particularly at our shipyards. There are other challenges. There are workforce challenges in our shipyards, just recruitment and retention of workforce welders, for example. There are supply chain challenges, contract challenges. So there are a range of challenges, but there's also just a capacity issue in our shipyards that the size of China's shipyards are enormous. So if you're looking at the ability of China to mass produce ships, either surface or subsurface, so think submarines, they have significant capacity.
So you've written about how the U.S. could maybe remedy this situation by relying more on certain allies. What are the challenges associated with that, and where are we at with
that? Yeah, so allies and partners are critical in all these theaters, including in the Pacific. It's hard to imagine a fight with the Chinese or any kind of contingency without relying on allies and partners for basing. I mean, the U.S. Has significant bases in Japan in particular.
Sure,
but also
the largest base in South Korea. Actually.
Yeah, but like Yokosuka is the hub for U.S. naval vessels in the region. It's got a big ground force presence, U.S. Forces Korea on the Korean Peninsula, and then it's got other allies, including Australia, where the U.S. is, when it builds its B-21 long-range bomber, will likely deploy them on northern parts of Australia. Now, on the shipbuilding, both the Japanese and the Koreans have huge shipbuilding capacity. There are some congressional restrictions, the Jones Act, for example, that make it very difficult for the U.S. to cooperate on shipbuilding with Japan or Korea. I think it's worth relooking at how do we collaborate in ways that make sense for the United States with some of our allies that also have some of this capacity. The other area is the U.S. operates largely on a peacetime footing when it comes to sharing technology, even to our closest allies. Think the British or the Australians operating in the Pacific. We still have huge barriers as part of our ITAR technology transfers and even foreign military sales to share technology with some of our closest allies and partners. That has to change. It's partly a Department of Defense, State Department, and congressional problem.
Let's look at futuristic capacity right now in artificial intelligence. One thing that actually has happened in the last 10 years or so is the creation within the Pentagon of the Defense Innovation Unit. And now in the last year, the evolution of a program called Replicator, which is essentially a DoD program to advance American capability to field autonomous drones, build them, and field them across spheres of conflict anywhere in the world. Tell me about how the Replicator program fits into this. Is this addressing this wider problem that you're focused on, or is it just sort of a Band-Aid to an immediate technological competition with China?
Well, look, I think Replicator is helpful in several respects. One is it does combine both the Department of Defense and the private sector, which is really at the end of the day what makes the U.S. competitive, and much more so over the Chinese. The Chinese, one of the biggest problems the Chinese are going to have over the long run is their defense companies are state-owned enterprises. The big advantage the U.S. has, if it can effectively partner, is with its innovative private sector. So part of Replicator is a convergence of the Defense Department and the private sector to build key weapons systems. So what Replicator does is it does pull together that public-private partnership to take advantage of innovation, including small companies, as well as in a critical area. Now, the caveat still is that is a component. When it comes to workforce challenges, supply chain, contracts, just the structure, Replicator will not solve in and of itself all of the problems. And I'm sure if we had senior Department of Defense officials, they would acknowledge Replicator does not solve all of the problems we've just talked about, but it is an important step in one particular area.
I want to shift gears and look at another piece of what China specifically is doing. We hear warnings from U.S. defense and intelligence analysts about the Chinese military and intelligence embrace of so-called cognitive warfare. I'd like to hear what you think about this and have to say on it, because your 2021 book, Three Dangerous Men, outlines how cyber attacks, irregular warfare, disinformation campaigns, espionage, economic coercion are tools of what China, Russia, Iran are doing. But where does cognitive warfare fit into this, and what do we need to know about it? And I ask in the context of the U.S. government right now in this push to potentially ban a social media app used by tens of millions of Americans, TikTok. What do you have to say about this?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, it is important to look at Chinese conventional military capabilities. That's the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah,
aircraft carriers, ships, hypersonics, all of that. In addition, the Chinese are also have a long tradition. So think Mao, for example, or Sun Tzu, a long tradition of also operating in the information or cognitive sphere. And what the Chinese have a range of concepts. For example, the three warfares, which are designed to expand Chinese influence and weaken its adversaries. And the U.S. is the most significant adversary of the Chinese through publication of material, social online media platforms, psychological warfare, and what the Chinese call lawfare. So think, for example, of the islands that the Chinese built, which were atolls in the South China Sea. They're now military bases. They were taken to court by several of the surrounding countries, including the Philippines, at The Hague. The Hague rules in favor of the Philippines. It was an illegal action by the Chinese. It's not their sovereign territory. The Chinese response to The Hague was, we don't acknowledge the authority of The Hague as a legal power. What we see is the Chinese spreading disinformation, misinformation on social media platforms through their state-run media, using clandestine assets, cutouts to expand the Chinese narrative. One interesting area where we've seen it is in movies, and it works in two slightly different ways. One is two of the most significant Chinese movies at the box office, so that's in China, are both wars against the United States. Battle at Lake Chongjin, and then Wolf Warrior 2, both wars against the United States. On the other side of this, because the Chinese have such a big market for movies, including Hollywood movies, Hollywood generally does not use China as an enemy, certainly the way Hollywood used the Nazis, Germany, or the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Think for like Hunt for Red October, Red Dawn. And it's because of fear of not getting market access in China. So, I mean, in some ways, it's a successful self-deterrence in Hollywood on the information side and the cognitive sphere that we're not highlighting in movies what historically we would have with the Nazis or the Soviets. So there are a range of areas where we've seen China aggressive on the information side to support their authoritarian regime.
Final question, what are the stakes here? Why are we talking about this? If the U.S. does not create urgency around this situation, the threat that China is outpacing the U.S. in the security and information realm, what does that mean for the future of the human species?
First, it's important to recognize when we talk about the People's Republic of China, who we're talking about. It's the Chinese Communist Party. It is a party and a country, government, that is authoritarian. This is Xi Jinping's now third term, not democratically elected. They increasingly have moved away from capitalism and a free market with state-owned enterprises. They do not support freedom of the press. They crack down, particularly within China, and very strongly have pushed back in many areas against freedom of religion. So it's a diametrically opposed to the DNA of the United States and how we were founded. What we've also seen, this is where this becomes concerning, is the Chinese are expanding power and influence. They're what we call a revanchist state. They're building power projection capabilities, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but much broader. They've got space-based platforms and a range of other military activity in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, strong trading partnerships with a number of other countries. So they are a major competitor who is attempting to push out U.S. power and influence in multiple regions of the globe. And I think, Taiwan is a perfect example, democratic nation, capitalist, free market economy, and we certainly could see Chinese invasion at some point in the next couple of years.
Seth Jones, so insightful, so interesting. Thank you very much for joining me for the Threat Status Influencer series. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.